If data is the new oil, where's the refinery? Welcome to TechFirst with John Koetsier. AI is driving innovation, competitive advantage, and speed to market. But what if you don't have enough training data? And what if your data is raw? Maybe it's not enriched. Maybe you have no metadata to help your AI make sense of what data you have. Then I guess you turn to maybe somebody like Samasource, which supplies training data for Google, IBM, Microsoft, and apparently a quarter of the Fortune 50. To find out where AI is going and where maybe training data is headed as well, we're chatting with Wendy Gonzalez, who's the president and CEO of Samasource. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you, John. Really glad to be here.
Excellent. Happy to have you. You supply training data for some of the world's top tech companies. And often when people think of AI, they think of computers, they think of code, they think of technology, they think of things that are horrifically complicated and complex that aren't understandable by maybe anybody, and especially not ordinary people who aren't techie. But you do training data. What is that? What's that component?
Yeah, so training data is really the basis for AI. So at the end of the day, machines need to learn how to speak, see, and hear. And they do so much like a human learns how to speak, see, and hear. What we do is training data, and that is really the labeled, structured data that teaches a machine or a computer how to do these things. So imagine you have a self-driving car application. It has cameras and sensors. It's driving down the roadway. It needs to be able to detect what is a pedestrian, what is a vehicle, what's a bicycle, what's a road sign, what's a drivable space. And that's basically what we do. We provide
Excellent.
output for that structured labeled data.
Good, good, good. I mean, that's obviously easily forgotten when you think about what AI, but if you don't have the data, you don't understand what the data is, you can't really do anything with it, correct?
That's exactly right. I think what's really kind of interesting that people maybe don't realize is that while all these investments are being made in AI, something like nearly 100 billion is predicted over the course of the next few years, none of this AI can be realized without training data. And it's
Yeah.
actually the majority of the reason why AI projects don't work well is because they're missing high quality structured data.
Excellent, excellent. And by the way, I full screened you there, and you mentioned right off the top that you didn't have an office in the place where you're staying, so you were in your daughter's bedroom. This is COVID times. This is what we do, right? So I'm glad you were able to join, and you've got good lighting, so it's all good. No worries.
Perfect.
Uh,
Perfect.
there's something cool about what you do. I mean, there's a lot of companies that outsource, and you do some outsourcing, obviously, but you do some outsourcing with a purpose. And that kind of caught my eye as I checked your website. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we aren't your typical sourcing company. We actually do something called impact sourcing. So we were founded in 2008 with a mission to move people out of poverty by giving them work. So the idea is that we recruit and work with people in very underserved communities. We provide them digital skills training, and then we hire them into work on these data labeling projects with the, really powering the world's leading technologies, provide them living wages and benefits, and it really creates a career path towards, future growth.
Right. Interesting. And I think the number that I saw on your site was 50,000 people that you have given a living wage to. Is that correct?
We have moved over 50,000 people out of poverty since we were founded in 2008. And to give you a
Wow.
sense of it, we are working in communities that where people make less than $2 a day, which is the World
Wow.
Bank standard for poverty. So it's something we are extremely proud of. And it really powers everything we do because people coming from these communities, these are not only folks who are incredibly talented, very bright, they really lack the opportunity for employment. And providing this environment, working in these, working on these very, very exciting technologies, we have great retention. And so as a result, not only are we lifting people out of poverty, but we have expert labelers, which is really neat.
Yeah. Talk about some of the areas that are hottest right now. I mean, what are your customers really looking for in terms of data that they're feeding you and asking you to explain what it is?
So we see things in really a few different areas. One in particular, we see a lot of growth in ARVR, so augmented reality and virtual reality. And this could really include everything. It's everything from faces, shirts, shoes, you name it, furniture, really anything that can be detected, all the way to autonomous transportation.
Hmm.
So you notice I don't see self-driving cars. We see it in trains and planes, in smart cities, and how you manage traffic. We're also seeing a lot of really interesting growth, as you would imagine, also in e-commerce. So a lot of things I would describe as visual search. So how do you actually look up something and detect whether it's a plaid shirt, as an example, right? So how do you define plaid?
Interesting.
You actually have to structure all that.
Interesting. I love that you said autonomous transportation. I mean, I think it was, I forget which airline it was. You probably remember, or it was in the news this morning or yesterday. An airplane took off and flew somewhere and landed autonomously. That was pretty impressive. I know of a startup in Russia that's doing autonomous driving or transportation for farm machinery as well as trains and other things like that. And of course, there's so much demand for autonomous robots for delivery last mile, right? So there's so much that needs
Mhm.
to be done there.
Yeah, it's incredible. We are working on a few projects specifically related to delivery robots, as an example.
Interesting. Maybe go into a little more detail on some of the training that you might do for an autonomous vehicle. What needs to be labeled, and how does that data get used?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I want to say the short answer is like everything ultimately in the scene needs to be labeled. So what happens often is we'll work with companies. They have both video data as well as sensor data. Right. So there are cameras on the cars that are pulling in information at different angles. There may be LiDAR or radar. So LiDAR is kind of the light detection, and it allows you to provide depth as well as being able to see things in a 2D fashion. And so we'll get literally tons of these videos and highly complex scenes. And there's something called semantic segmentation, to where literally in some cases you are putting a label towards every pixel in the entire photo. So you might be covering and outlining a vehicle, a parked vehicle, drivable space, non-drivable space, traffic signs. Imagine how complex the scenarios are, because take all of that, apply it to local roads, freeways, all across the world, and then put weather on top of it.
Yes.
So sunny,
Yes.
rainy, hail. So it's quite complex. Yes.
Every pixel.
In some cases, yeah, that's called semantic segmentation. Yeah, some cases you have every single pixel, because as you can imagine, the level of accuracy and quality that's really required is absolutely huge. Imagine a car getting on the road that cannot detect certain types of vehicles, or doesn't know when something is like a car is behind another car, right? So it's a
Yes.
little bit more complicated than you actually think.
Or a Tesla that sees a white semi on basically in front of it in the road and doesn't identify that as a vehicle or a barrier and slams into it and the occupant dies. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, safety, and you'll hear me say often quality. Oftentimes, what people talk about in terms of training data is quality. And what that really means is how accurate is that labeling and that segmentation. Because that's certainly one example. You could take it in a number of different ways. Imagine if vehicles couldn't detect different sizes and shapes of people as pedestrians. That would be pretty problematic. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And we know we already have those issues with regard to face color, for instance, for a variety of different AI things, perhaps hopefully not transportation related, but certainly AI systems that are built to solve problems commercially for people. So you're pretty in tune. You're providing training data for AI systems for 25% of the Fortune 50. You're pretty in tune with what's going on in AI, what's changing. What's in most demand, and how has that changed over the years that you've been in business?
Yeah, I think that, ultimately the technology is still relatively new. Right? So if you think about the primary adoption of AI really started 10, 11 years ago. So what's kind of amazing that people sort of don't think about when it comes to machine learning is that it's still relatively new. So there's a lot of tools and infrastructure that I think are being built right now. It's happening, the advancement is happening very, very quickly. So from the perspective, especially of what we do, is that gone are the days, is there a car in this picture, or is there a dog or a cat? It
We
is
would
moving.
hope.
Yeah, we would hope, exactly. So it's incredible how quickly things are advancing. And so when I maybe sound a little bit repetitive saying quality, it's because the smarter AI gets, the more you're finding edge cases, right? So if everything was kind of completely labeled, well, then, we'd be in the singularity, John. Like all AI would be possible, right? So what's happening is you get into more and more edge cases, use cases, and I think one of the key things is that when you're thinking about your AI application, one of the biggest questions that should be made, but that we also believe very strongly in, is, do you have the right set of data? it's not just about having all the volumes of data, but that example we were just talking about in terms of self-driving cars. Imagine if you had a representation of hundreds of thousands of vehicles, but only like 10 motorcycles, right? Then you've got immediately kind of an inherent bias. And so you have to really worry about not just to get the quality data, but do you have the right and most comprehensive, representative data?
Interesting. Very interesting. So you need some human expertise at some level to say, hey, you've got great data, but in a small subset, or you're missing something else or something along those lines.
Yeah, I like the word last mile. So you mentioned that with delivery robots. I feel it's the same with quality in terms of training data, is that the human context and judgment is so key. Imagine, I mean, you can probably look, there's all these sorts of really, really interesting examples with data sets. It's like if you have, a computer vision algorithm can like identify a chair if it's standing upright. But if like you tip it over or set it on a bed, people the machines, like, I don't even understand the context of this. Like, what does this really mean? So that human judgment and context to, help the algorithm get as smart as possible is absolutely critical.
Interesting. Very interesting. What's providing the most competitive advantage right now?
I think it is ultimately it is about quality as well as classification. So how do you understand what is the most comprehensive set of data? How do you understand what you're missing? Right. So that
Mhm.
example of unrepresentative data is a key one. So classification, sort of analytics to understand what you're not doing well at, and then having not only a solution that can sort of do the heavy lifting. So we do have a platform. We try to do as much machine learning assisted annotation as possible. We leverage our humans to get to that last mile of quality,
Yes.
and ultimately that is really the differentiation. I would also say that, diversity in your labeling workforce as well as continuity is important. Oftentimes, a lot of companies in this space, they use something, they use the crowd, right? And so
Yes.
you have somebody completely different. You don't necessarily know their background. So, kind of visibility, security, and trust is something that we find particularly important with the largest enterprises. But beyond that, if it's kind of a revolving door, getting into those really difficult edge cases that we were just talking about, if you don't have any continuity and the use cases get more and more complex, I think that's also quite a challenge.
Yes, yes, interesting. So we talked about COVID-19 already once. You're not in your office, obviously,
No.
but how has COVID-19, various lockdowns and quarantines affected AI and training data, and maybe even investing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we are seeing slowdowns in some areas and growth in others. We have a variety of customers, as you can imagine. Those clients in like hospitality or manufacturing definitely suffered some slowdowns. We also have seen some delays in data collection. So when we were talking about representative data, if you can't get out there and drive around on the street, or your country or city's in lockdown, that definitely has caused some implications. And then by the same token, we've seen strong growth in other areas. ARVR is just absolutely chugging along.
Mhm.
E-commerce is as well, delivery robots. So yeah, it depends on the industry, but as a whole, I think one of the things we've seen is that, especially in the space we work on, is that there's a massive amount of data that you need, and we've actually seen for our business some level of growth, actually real growth, because you know you need that. I think if data is the new oil, yeah, I think that's a very good analogy. It's like they need that flow of information to continue their progress.
Very interesting. Anything in robotics has to be pretty huge. I have a friend who is building and shipping these autonomous. I wouldn't call it a barista. It's like a box. You buy a box, and there's a coffee shop, a robotic coffee shop, and you put it down somewhere, and somebody can get a coffee, presumably hot chocolate, latte, whatever, from the robot. And apparently, it's pretty good. So, but yeah, lots of training data needed for all those things. I don't know how much data he needs annotated for that business, though.
Yeah, there's all sorts of kind of thoughts over how much data do you really need? And if you're trying to prove something, is it, 10,000 images or 15,000 images? If you're trying to, get something into production, and how big is it? Is it 100 or 200? It really depends on the complexity of what you're trying to solve for. So, like I said, in the case of like self-driving car, imagine you may need thousands, if not maybe in the millions of like road miles driven to be able to address all the different scenarios. So yeah, again, I think
Mhm.
it depends.
Actually, a really good question here from Doug Bennett. He says, well, the question is, how long do you expect this gold rush to last? I mean, we've seen an expansion, or should we say an acceleration in retail, e-commerce, m-commerce, parts of retail, 4 to 6 years or something like that, according to Adobe data. We've seen an acceleration of other trends in terms of remote work, other things like that. Do you expect that this acceleration for the need for AI and AI training data to continue?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's pervasive across every industry. I mean, ultimately anticipating that we the world starts to kind of get back to normal. There's no limit to the adoption of machine learning and AI. So like we've worked on everything from sustainable fishing to reducing elephant poaching to financial services classification. It's incredibly pervasive. I mean, there are many estimates that say that 80% of consumers are already using some form of AI enabled product. It's only going to get, I think, more and more pervasive.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you use Facebook or if you use Google search or something like that, you're touching AI or getting benefits from AI in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, right? One of my favorites was Google delivers it with Project Loon. They deliver internet via weather balloons or balloons in the air in Kenya, and the balloons are self-driving in a sense, in that they have a machine learning algorithm that tells them to go up or down based on where the wind velocities are, and somehow with a certain number of balloons and some that get transitioned out of service and maybe repositioned manually, they manage to maintain coverage by going slower here, faster there, different directions. There's a lot that we can use AI for. That kind of feeds into my next question for you. Where do you see AI going next? What do you see being super hot over the next few years?
Yeah, so we are seeing, we are seeing, and I think we will continue to see quite a bit in the ARVR space. We're going to continue to see tons of investments because, I mean, at the end of the day, especially in our business of training data, you know, there's no limit to sort of what is included in reality or virtual or augmented reality. So the amount of objects and classifications is absolutely very, very large. We definitely see a lot in healthcare. There's an incredible amount that can be done in healthcare and life sciences. Even, for example, what's happening, obviously in this terrible pandemic, we worked on a project with Mila, one of the leading AI research facilities, to create a chat bot, basically, that allowed people to identify symptoms. Imagine taking that same application to, for example, lung scans. There are many, many different examples there as well. We've worked on, surgical robotics, you name it. So we see a lot there too.
Very, very interesting. Wendy, I want to thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, for everybody else as well, thank you for joining us on Tech First. My name is John Koetsier. Really appreciate you being along for the show. You'll be able to get a full transcript of this podcast in about a week at johnkoetsier.com. You'll see the story on Forbes shortly after that. Of course, the full video will be available on my YouTube channel. And thanks for joining. Maybe share with a friend. Until next time, this is John Koetsier with Tech First.